You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your politically confused host, Abraham.
And I am your not sure if I'm Democratic host, Shane.
We are a psychology podcast, and we talk about all the things that happens inside of psychology, which could include humans, it could include animals. Sometimes it could even include plants or even AI. We haven't done two of those things, but they're on the table. It could happen.
But we could.
Yeah, we could do it if we want to. Today, we're doing a very US-centric episode. So for all of you non-US people who are into geopolitics, this might be of some interest to you.
Yeah. I think this will be a fun historical episode.
Yeah, and that's the big thing. Is it's a big history episode. It's just history of the United States specifically. Most of our listeners are here. I hope that this does not bore people to tears who don't live here, but I feel like there's some interest because there are some things that overlap here with other countries.
Well, and I think the other part of it too is that politics impact helping services. They, like many of us, are trying to analyze why people are doing what they do from a political standpoint. So it's probably worth looking at kind of maybe some values-based discussions around politics. So there's some stuff to unpack here that are absolutely psychology and behavioral related.
There you
go.
go.
I don't think it's not something that's like tangentially related that we're like, oh, I guess like there's a lot to unpack within this.
Totally agree. Now, if you enjoy what you hear today, or you've listened to us in the past and you have not yet done so, maybe consider subscribing. It'll make sure that we're always showing up for you week after week, reliable as the mail, or more so, arguably, because no one's in charge of us. We're in charge of us.
Yeah, and we're consistent.
We are so consistent. Also, tell a friend if you like us. You can join us on Patreon. You can do a hairdo to make it look like either one of us, and then then people will be like, hey, who are you supposed to be? And then you can say these two awesome podcast hosts.
Yeah, we would love to see that Halloween costume.
That would be really interesting. Of course, you can pick up some merch at our merch store. I'll talk more about all of that at the end of this. But today, this episode comes out on November 23rd. And November 23rd is a Wednesday, like all of our episodes come out. But there's some unique holidays on November 23rd. What are we celebrating today, Shane?
So today we are celebrating Jukebox Day, which is fun. You should not bully the jukebox because that makes you the worst person. It's also National Cashew Day, which is one of my favorites.
Yeah. I was very pleased to discover that it is National Espresso Day, which makes me very happy. Yep.
Yes.
100% on board with that. Makes a lot of sense. I like this is great. I like this whole thing. And then it's also Fibonacci Day. So if you are spiraling or like spirals, then spiral out with Fibonacci Day.
Yeah, or you like spirographs even.
There you go. That's right.
Yeah.
Snail shells. We would be remiss if we did not wish you a happy Thanksgiving tomorrow, or whenever you listen to this. Hope you had a happy Thanksgiving. You're having a happy Thanksgiving. Whatever. Maybe put this on so the whole family can listen as you're doing prep. Could be a thing.
Yeah, I think that'll go over well. Yeah, that's exactly what you need at your Thanksgiving dinner, is a talk about politics.
that should really help things go smoothly.
Yeah, I think that'll go really well. Yeah. That won't cause any confusion at all. So,
yeah.
Also, the pro-capitalist day of Black Friday is a thing, but that's, please don't trample each other, be kind to each other, and get those deals if you need to.
And then the entire month of November, we've been talking about some of the sort of monthly celebrations. There's two left that we haven't mentioned. It is Pomegranate Month, which absolutely, pomegranate's delicious. And it is also Novel Writing Month. So you've been putting off
novels
that
are
novel.
Delicious too.
They are two tasty treats. Novel pomegranates and pomegranate novels.
Yes, I would love to read a book about pomegranates while I eat pomegranates. Could you imagine?
That
the
sounds
inception
great.
That goes along with that.
That's right. Like, what's real? So potentially you can be eating some cashews and pomegranates while listening to the jukebox, staring at spirals, planning for your Thanksgiving and Black Friday shopping, and you will be celebrating in the most thorough possible way.
Yes, that sounds like a really great day. Cashews and pomegranates go really well together, actually.
It does sound like a good combination. That seems like a Thanksgiving-y type of thing. I get why it's on there.
Yeah, I'm here for it.
Yeah.
I support it.
Well, we're not actually talking about any of those things, really, although kind of.
Nope.
Black Friday maybe is a little wrapped into this in a very roundabout way. We're talking about history, the history of politics in the United States, and one specific thing, which is that there has been some confusion around the history of the political parties and their ideologies. And so I want to set the stage for you. Okay. So I want you to imagine a political party that advocates for taxes, for like an income tax, for spending taxes on social safety nets and welfare and social security, national federal policies that are consistent across all states, and the expansion of government-funded transportation, state-sponsored colleges, and government protection of marginalized groups. And you're thinking, for most people, it's really obvious which very liberal political party I am talking about. Obviously, the Republicans.
Of course.
Specifically, the Republicans of the late 1800s.
Yes. So, and we're also going to spend some time talking about slaveholder Democrats. So get ready for that to unpack. Hopefully you all will not leave the show as a result of this discussion, but it's worth talking about.
Yeah, we've got some history to unpack here. So all of this is background because it's all history. And so it all sort of is leading up. So we're going to sort of follow a timeline of events. You don't need to memorize these dates, but there are some that might stand out to you as being relevant, particularly with respect to some important things that took place and how some things have been categorized. All right. So to begin with, the first major political parties in the United States were the Federalists and the Republican Democrats. And those were liberal and conservative respectively. So you had liberal Federalists. Liberal back then is not going to mean exactly what it does today. I'll describe that in a second. And then you have the conservative Republican Democrats. So in the Federalists, you had George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and John Adams. Should be all familiar names. Yeah. These were considered liberal Federalists. Their major point that they pushed for was a national bank. That was like the talking point of all talking points constantly for decades when this was going on, was a national bank. There was also some talk of things like international road system and some like federal regulations around industry, that sort of thing. Those are all sort of Federalists. On the other side of that, you had the Republican Democrats. This consisted of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. And so this is the conservative group, the Republican Democrats. They wanted very little government oversight on things, and they wanted mostly states and local areas to be responsible for forming their own policies about what laws were in place. They wanted very little in the way of any kind of federal structure or federal regulation of any kind. They liked the agrarian feel. This is like, we're a nation of farmers. We're all sort of spread out. We all have our own way of doing things, and that's totally fine. So that was sort of the conservative Republican Democrat side of things.
So understanding that, it's worth kind of talking about what these political parties looked like at the time. So Federalists had very little support and very few members and essentially dissolved into obscurity. The Federalists just disappeared. Essentially what happened. Like, and it makes sense as the industrial nation kind of grows and technology advances and farming becomes less and less, kind of for the people, even though it still is. It was one of those things where the support for the Federalists kind of dipped off, where Republican Democrats eventually became the only major party and really were at the time. And this meant that they were just a bunch of Republican Democrats running against each other. So there was no like Democrat versus Republican. Everybody was a Republican Democrat. There were actually 4 big contenders for president in 1824. Could you imagine an election where there are 4 potential candidates that all have an equal opportunity to possibly win?
No, I cannot imagine what that would be. I cannot either.
Like. That's not happened in our lifetime.
No, that almost never happens anywhere anymore. That's becoming increasingly uncommon. That would be a wild world that I kind of want to live in,
Yeah, I want to live in that world.
But anyway, that's kind of an interesting thing. So anyway, during this election of 1824, John Quincy Adams, he lost the popular vote to conservative Andrew Jackson. However, John Quincy Adams became the president because no one won enough of the electoral votes to secure the presidency, and it ended up being decided on by the House of Representatives, who then chose John Quincy Adams as the winner, although Andrew Jackson had the popular vote. And so John Quincy Adams was the liberal Republican Democrat. Andrew Jackson was the conservative Republican Democrat, because again, there's just those two parties.
And so then in 1828, the Democratic Party forms. And it seems to kind of have splintered off from this thing, right? So this event happens, and now we've got the Democratic Party as like a thing that has occurred in the United States.
So the two major parties that exist today are Republicans and Democrats in the United States. Arguably, you've got Libertarians and Green Party and Independents and there's like a few other parties that are in there, but the two major parties that have the most representation and the most people who vote for them consistently are Republicans and Democrats. Okay. Back then we had just the Republican Democrats, but because of the split that happened, that there were so many Republican Democrats, they essentially divided again. And then you had the Democratic Party form in 1828. That was the first of the current parties that was created in 1828. And then it was just the Democrats versus the Whig Party. Now, there were other parties. Yeah. There was like the Free Soil Party, and there was still some Federalists around, and like there were other parties like trying to like get their foot in the door. But it was really just the Democrats versus the Whigs. And as we said, the Republican Democrats were the conservative party. So the Democrats are the conservative party. The Whigs then would be that liberal party.
Right. So then the Whigs formed what we now know as the Republican Party. They formed the Republican Party in 1854. And so then it became the Democrats, who were the conservatives, and Republicans, who were the liberals. The Whigs, or the liberals, advocated for a national bank and government regulations. And the Whigs also criticized their opponent, Andrew Jackson, calling him a jackass. Which it's nice to know that things don't change.
Right.
You know, and which is how the Democratic Party got the donkey as the spirit animal.
Yeah.
I loved it. Like the donkey came around as like a sarcastic, like, oh yeah, you're going to, okay, here we are. We're the jackasses. And now we are the donkeys.
Yep. And that was the liberals poking fun at the conservatives, if you will, at the time.
Right. Absolutely.
So kind of interesting here. The Republicans, the liberals, were the party of wealth. They're a party of big business, and they're a party of big government. And now one thing that we're going to touch on again later is the fact that at the time, big government was good for big business. Like government regulation, government support meant essentially paving the way for industry to grow and expand. So those wealthy sort of tycoons who were building industries, they tended to favor liberal policies because those liberal policies helped further their endeavor to grow their industries. Regulations were actually extremely helpful for helping these businesses become successful and thrive and grow, because essentially this oversight made it so that it's the reason why like we tend to have supervisors in like mental health practice and have like other people who are sort of watching over us. And even when we're sort of at the top of the rung, we'll have people come in and audit and check on how we're doing, because having other people have eyes on what you're doing just helps ensure that we're all sort of staying on the same page and prevents drift away from things. And so I think that was part of what was going on at the time, is the fact that regulation actually helped big business thrive and succeed.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now, Democrats, who at this time are the conservative party, I want to be clear about that, were very much in support of slavery.
Yep.
And you're going to see it through their patterns of behavior. So here's what they were doing. They not only wanted to preserve it, but they wanted to expand it to other states and parts of the country. So they used what they called state rights, which you hear that argument all the time about states' rights.
Yep. That one never went away.
That's my favorite argument about the Civil War. People are like, it wasn't about slavery, it was about state rights. And everybody goes, well, state rights to do what?
Yeah.
And it comes back to slavery. So they used state rights as a means to an end to support being able to establish state policies that differed from government policy. And so if their government policy differed from what they wanted, which again was to enslave humans, then they were against it. So they wanted state rights to do what they wanted to do. But the Democrats at the time were very much so involved with the idea of state rights to preserve slavery.
And at the time, the conservative party, the Democrats, they continued to share in Thomas Jefferson's original view of the country as this agrarian farmer society. And they viewed the idea of this centralized government as an enemy of individual liberty. All sounds very familiar, right? These are the conservative Democrats. Yeah. So the conservative position here was that of that government bad for individuals.
Right.
So we're going to quickly summarize the Civil War in the United States. Essentially, the Democrats secede. The South, but functionally the Democrats.
Yeah.
The Southern Democrats. They secede to start their own country in the South, where presumably the federal Southern government would enshrine the right to own slaves in their constitution. Again, to them, it's okay with big government if big government does already aligns with their ideology, which in this case was to enslave other humans.
Right. Now, there's a civil war, the South loses, and the Confederate government is dissolved. Lincoln emancipates the enslaved people, except in Texas, where they conveniently forgot to tell the slaves they were freed for over 2 years. That's a thing that happened,
yep.
Which is just wild. And then at this time, the South is very conservative, agrarian, and anti-business, which,
yep.
times they are not a changing.
Yes. So while the South is that way, the North is largely liberal, largely the Republicans, right? And as the controlling body of government and the one that had just, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, they had just essentially reunited the states under the banner of the United States. They introduced policies for voting rights for African American people. And of course, at this time, this is the 1800s, the mid to late 1800s. So when I say African American people, what I mean is African American men, because women, of course, were not going to get the right to vote for decades.
Right. Absolutely. Now that we've kind of come out of the Civil War, it's probably worth taking a big breath, taking a break, re-establishing what your political views are. And we're going to take a quick ad break so that you can process what we just told you.
Okay, so we've been talking about the parties and what they stood for up to the Civil War. Okay, and so now we're basically just past the Civil War. Republicans are in control of most things. They're considered very liberal. They tend to push for policies that give voting rights to minorities. They're also pushing for economic growth and expansion. And again, just thinking about the fact that big government that has a lot of federal policies that affect all states, this was good for big business, that it essentially made it easier to do business, grow your business, and allow industries to really thrive and grow.
Now, around the 1870s, wealthy business moguls were starting to enter politics. And so that's where you start seeing money enter the picture in a little different way, right?
Yep.
Many people of the Republican Party were congratulating themselves for all that they had done for black citizens and didn't see black people as an important part of the population. So it was kind of like, oh, good job. We're not going to really offer them more rights, but, we're doing the right thing and we're taking care of these people when they really weren't doing a whole lot for equality.
Yeah, they're basically like, hey, we did the good thing. Now we can go back to doing the thing that we want to do and ignore that they exist.
Right.
And so they kind of basically just dropped their efforts and did not continue to push reform policies that would help support these relatively recently freed African Americans in the South and other parts of the country as well. They just sort of saw them as not particularly important and didn't really matter, and sort of like, hey, we did our part. You're on your own now,
right? And
sort of left them to defend for themselves.
Now, the conservative Democrats, bitter from the war and full of vitriolic racist hatred, were all ready to impose many oppressive policies towards black people, as many as they could possibly manage. So they really went hard on this. They were like, we are going to make it real rough. And then they were going, states' rights,
yeah,
as part of that.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, the victims in all of this are the African American people who are just trying to live and survive, largely left behind by the North and struggling to get by in a society that either didn't care about them or was even actively trying to oppress them or harm them as much as possible. So, this is a lose-lose situation, unfortunately.
Yeah. So at this point in time, we have left the Civil War. We are reconstructing. There are things going on. The country is expanding. And so after the Civil War, 14 states would enter the Union for the next 3 to 4 decades. Idaho, Washington, Utah, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona were entering right around the time this kind of political drift was happening, where the liberal folks were not really involved in reform anymore. The Southern folks were really bitter. The Democrats were really bitter. So there's a lot of kind of animosity going on while these states are entering the picture.
And for those who are really familiar with states' histories, I did leave out Alaska and Hawaii because those were kind of much later than the last state that happened sort of during this period. So I understand that there was actually 16.
Yeah.
As we said, that there's this expanding westward going on. And a lot of people who are out here sort of roughing it on their own and trying to make do with what they've got, they do not have a lot of resources. They're relatively poor. They really did want and need support if they were going to do this thing of colonizing out west and, ripping away homes from indigenous people. So they were eager for support from the federal government in their endeavor.
So this is where we enter William Jennings Bryan, who's a Democrat, again, conservative, from Illinois, who later moved to Nebraska.
Yeah, right around the time that Nebraska was formed or shortly thereafter. And so quoting American history professor Eric Rauchway, I think is how they pronounce that.
That's how I would read that.
Yeah, so he suggests that Bryan, William Jennings Bryan here, was one of the pivotal figures that sort of began to blur the lines in American politics and began to shift the Democrats from very conservative to a little bit more liberal.
Yeah, and so Bryan was elected to the House of Representatives in 1890 and served for 5 years. He supported a national income tax and other policies that were not very popular amongst most conservatives. So as you think about this, okay, remember, he's a Democrat who is conservative, and he starts looking at national policies. He starts looking at things that are going to piss off the conservatives that he's working with, and you start seeing kind of that shift towards what we know of Democrats today.
And this idea of paying taxes, yeah. So Bryan had a bid to run for president as the Democratic candidate in 1896. He failed to secure the nomination for the Democratic candidate in that election cycle, but he was actually nominated as the Democratic candidate and ran again in 1900 against then incumbent Republican liberal President William McKinley, to whom he, of course, lost because nobody knows his name.
Right.
He did have a final presidential bid in 1908 against, again, Republican liberal William Howard Taft, to, again, whom he also lost.
Right. Fun fact, I am related to Taft.
Are you really?
Yeah, he's an ancestor of mine. It probably explains my size.
Does that mean that you're a Taft punk?
I'm Taft Punk. Yeah, it's a strong. I don't have a mask. I don't know those songs. That's not my music. Now, if you look at the electoral map at the time, and we'll link it in the show notes and all that stuff, but it is nearly reversed to a contemporary map, and I'm looking at it, and it is wild. The entire South is blue. The entire North is red. California is red. It is wild looking.
So Colorado, Nebraska, Virginia, Maryland, all of these are like Texas, Florida. All of these are blue, carrying a bunch of electoral votes. Yeah.
Yeah. And then California, Washington, New York, Pennsylvania are all red.
Yep. So again, and that's why it's like that was the ideology at the time, is that red, Republican, meant liberal, blue, Democrat meant conservative.
Right.
And how this all looks. So, all right. We've been framing all this up with all these presidents and all that stuff happening. What happens is that the Republicans are able to secure 4 consecutive presidential election cycles where they win, which is a lot. That's a lot more than almost I think that had ever happened up to that point. It's more than has probably happened since in consecutive presidential bids. The Democrats were finally able to then win the presidency by electing Woodrow Wilson at, I think, the 1912 election, if I'm remembering correctly.
So then Wilson appoints William Jennings Bryan back into it as the Secretary of State in 1913. During his tenure, Bryan was notably celebrated for negotiating peace treaties at the end of the First World War. He negotiated treaties that functionally allowed the government to expand its control. So again, this is kind of a departure from what we know of Democrats.
Yeah, conservative Democrat, but he's doing these things that are like not what conservative Democrats normally do.
Right. So he also found himself at odds with Wilson, the person who appointed him, with respect to policies towards non-combatant neutrals during wartime. And this disagreement led to Bryan resigning his position in 1915.
Now, Bryan also advocated for government's role in ensuring things like social justice, which, again, not very popular in that party, specifically by exercising and even expanding federal power. And this, of course, was traditionally a much more Republican stance to take. So it was like he was championing some of the conservative Democratic values, but also making active moves to secure what were sort of traditionally liberal Republican values.
Right. Doing this as a Democrat.
As a conservative Democrat, yeah.
Now, as may be obvious, around the turn of the 20th century, both parties were trying to win power and influence policies. It's kind of what happens in politics, right?
Yep.
Conservative Democrats started including some civil liberties and federal programs as part of their platform in a bid to gain votes of new voting blocks of people, which, I mean, if you want to like kind of overlay that with today, that's why you find a lot of like politicians there tend to be more centrist, but include some on both sides. We'll talk about that
once they get past the primaries. Yeah.
We'll talk about that later. But both tried to promise to help overcome the issues that many people were facing: lack of social safety nets, few resources, few government protections. And so you start seeing kind of that shift change in these elections.
Yeah. So basically, for a while, there was not a lot to distinguish the parties from one another. They ended up sort of pushing fairly similar platforms because they're like, we have this whole new voting group of people that are African Americans. We have this whole new voting group of people that's even larger, that are people expanding out and forming new states. They give us more electoral votes and that sort of thing. And so they're trying to appeal to them as much as possible so they can get control. And that means turning to policies that tend to be fairly popular, right? And so what happens then is, in 1929, the stock market crashes. It drives our economy straight into a depression very rapidly, very severely. often called the Great Depression, our economy is just in the pooper, as you might say.
Yeah.
And at the time, the sitting president was, because they had been, a Republican. This was a liberal Republican, Herbert Hoover. And Hoover, for whatever reason, chose to do basically nothing about this. He was like, let's not intervene. This will sort of course correct, I think was his logic. We're not going to do anything about the stock market crash. And so because that was his policy, because it happened under his watch, everyone in the country is basically like, the Republicans did this, blame the Republicans, blame Hoover, we're done with you guys.
Right. And a point to make about that is, remember, Republican being liberal at the time,
yes,
their stance was big business, government involvement. That was a thing. And he chose to do the opposite of what the party stood for, which is why people started blaming liberal Republicans at the time for that, because they didn't do what the party stood for.
Right.
Just, I want to keep reiterating that as we go forward, because I want people to be really clear about, like, and kind of undoing what they know of today's people. Now, Roosevelt, who's a Democrat, conservative Democrat, well, maybe, ran on a platform of government intervening in the Depression and government welfare. He won by a landslide. And again, these are not policies related to the Democratic Party at the time.
Right.
He won by a landslide in the 1932 election, entering office at the beginning of 1933.
Okay. So essentially there was a big catalyst event here. There are two main things that are going on we set the stage for. There is a huge expansion out west where there's a lot of new states being created relatively quickly. There's like one every decade kind of for a while, or averaging that. There was actually a few that sort of happened similarly in time. But anyway, then we also have that there was recently emancipated group of people who are now constituent voter bloc, particularly once they got some voting rights. And then the third thing, I guess, that was really critical is the stock market crash. And so all of these events happened fairly close in time to one another, but that stock market crash really pushed things into overdrive, into big changes happening. And so the Democrats, the conservative party, specifically Roosevelt, come into power during this very tumultuous time where a lot of people are suffering. And they're basically like, we're going to win favor. We're going to get people on our side. And so they put several social programs into place to help those people suffering. Many people will have maybe heard of this thing called the New Deal, where the Green New Deal basically got its name was from this FDR's The New Deal, which included such radical policies. Again, this is coming from a Democrat who at the time was considered conservative, but was coming into government at the time where like things had just completely fallen apart. So the New Deal consisted of minimum wage, the idea of a minimum wage, again, like, whoa.
Mind-blowing. Less than 100 years old.
Yeah, that's right. So, that is a very good point. Government spending to build infrastructure, also something that very consistently against the values and ideology of the Conservative Party. Social Security, again, an absolute big no-no with respect to to the conservatives, and then pension programs, so essentially retirement accounts. And that wasn't all of it. Like, those are just some of the big highlights. So these are all policies that the conservative Democrat coming into the situation is like, we've got to save this country. This is what we're going to do. Puts these into place. These are not conservative policies.
Yeah, these more align with the Republican Party at the time.
Right.
So while you chew on that and you think about the New Deal and maybe even the Green New Deal, we're going to go ahead and implement some big business practices and share some advertisements.
Okay, so we sort of left this on a cliffhanger that essentially the Democrats came in, introduced, so this is the Conservative Party, introduced some very liberal policies. So what is going to be the effect of those constituent voters who helped put into place a Democrat, their conservative champion? These were slaveholders, like people that had been just recently slaveholders who had had their slaves taken away. They really did not like what their conservative, quote unquote, Democrat elect was doing. They're like, whoa, we elected this person who's a Democrat and you're putting in these liberal policies. What is going on? They left the Democratic Party in droves. There was a big middle finger and they're like, this is not what we signed up for. We're going to the Republican Party. So all these slaveholders, all these ultra conservatives, all of these, we want small government, no taxes. We want to enslave people. They were like, listen, the Democrats are not our party anymore. We're going over to the Republicans.
Right. That's an important shift. That is a huge shift at a time where you are leading up to World War II. You are coming out of the Great Depression or in the middle of it, right? Like there's a lot of stuff that's galvanizing the United States right now. Like a lot of things are happening that are like really people are digging in their heels in.
Yeah.
Because people are struggling. Like it is a bad time for the United States.
And they're about to start suffering from lead poisoning all over the place.
Right. It just, when you think about it, is there really a decade where the United States hasn't had people suffering?
No.
Like when you really truly think about it, the 80s had fanny packs and that was just as bad as the lead poisoning, I think. So
we are a nation of sufferers.
So obviously it's all perspective, right?
Yeah,
so it's all contextual. Now,
we're obviously not like in a place of we're so privileged we can afford to sit here and record a podcast. Like we're not terribly damaged. But the other thing is like there are people in this country who are starving to death right now. So
right,
like that is a thing that's going on here.
There are a lot of problems.
Yes,
there are a lot of problems. What I'm saying here more so is at this time there are a lot of major cataclysmic events that are impacting and shaping the way the country is going to look for decades to come.
Yeah, and by this time we're talking about back in the 30s and 40s, the 1930s and 40s in the United States.
And again, less than 100 years ago, which is wild. Now, Roosevelt, who was the only president to run and win 4 elections before the 2-term limit was ratified into the Constitution in the 22nd Amendment, died in office in 1945. So his then vice president, Harry S. Truman, also a Democrat, assumed the responsibilities of the presidency. And that includes the policies that they've put in. That includes the Green New Deal. That includes all the things that he inherited from that previously conservative, but now left-leaning Democratic Party.
Just New Deal, not the Green New Deal yet. That was...
I'm sorry. Yes, the New Deal is what I meant. The New Deal. We're not at AOC yet. I don't think she's not even born yet. So we're not even there yet.
No, barely a twinkle in her parents' eye.
Or grandparents even.
Or grandparents, yeah. So yeah, Truman takes over for Roosevelt, who was functionally a liberal Democrat at this point. And Truman also advocated for a pro-civil rights platform, which at the time gained a lot of support from African-American voters who are now switching to Democrat because they had been mostly historically supporters of the Republican Party. That was the anti-slavery party. The Republicans that were liberal put in the policies that ended slavery, much to the chagrin of the then conservative Democrats. But then, of course, as I said, ideologically, they switched places, Roosevelt being one of the key factors or one of the key presidents that then switched. There were others, as we've mentioned. But with all the other pro-slavery Democrats, conservatives, and anti-civil rights people switching to the Republican Party, the parties at this point had functionally changed. So again, that sort of drove those constituent voters over to the Democrats instead.
Absolutely. And that's a huge change. I mean, that's the equivalent of the poles switching positions on the earth. Like that's a huge change. You could see its effects today. Now, many astute listeners will likely have noticed that the big business platform of the Republicans in the 1800s sounds a lot like what we see of Republicans today. And that's true. This element of the Republican Party did not really change. American historian and professor Eric Rauchway wrote that, quote, although the rhetoric and to a degree the policies of the parties do switch places, the Republicans remain throughout the party of bigger businesses. It's just that in the earlier era of bigger businesses, they wanted bigger government. And in the later era, they don't.
Right.
End quote.
So basically what we're saying in all of this is that there was not a super clear switching point. There were some catalyst events that more or less spurred the ideological flip between the once conservative Democrats and the once liberal Republicans, notably the stock market crash, but also many things leading up to that were sort of pushing the boundaries of those two parties and what they meant. But that is a thing that happened. And I think, so if you listen to people in the news cycle, a lot of people on the right like to say, well, the Democrats used to be slaveholders. And I think the easier way to understand this is without the label of Democrat and Republican, because functionally what we're talking about is liberal versus conservative. Like that's kind of how most the dichotomies in many of the governments around the world sort of operate, is liberal versus conservative. What that means sort of varies from place to place, but essentially you usually have something like social safety nets, infrastructure, government regulation, government sort of putting in policies to support people in general by distributing equality as much as they possibly can in various ways, right? That's sort of liberal policies.
Right.
Conservative policies are things like individuals have the right to do whatever they want. Government shouldn't impose their will on people unless their will is to let people do whatever they want. There's includes and is not limited to harming other people. And so those tend to be highly authoritarian. Conservative governments skew toward extreme authoritarianism. Like that's when you look at extremely authoritarian countries, what they'll say is they're socialist or they're communist or whatever. But in practice, a communist and a dictatorship, you literally can't tell the difference. They're the exact same thing. Like you have one person who runs everything or a very small handful of people who run everything. They do whatever. They force everyone to bend to their whim. And so those are actually conservative policies, the policies that give an enormous amount of power to a very small number of people. Those are conservative policies. And so that's sort of how they've shaken out in the history of things. And so really what you're saying is like, those Democrats, were slaveholders, like they were the ones pushing these Jim Crow laws and that sort of thing. A better way to say this is the conservatives were slaveholders. The conservatives were pushing Jim Crow laws. The conservatives were pro-slavery. They were anti-civil rights. They were anti-women's voting. They were typically pro-war, but anti everything that was those pro-civil liberties, pro-social safety nets, pro-government spending, pro-taxes, that sort of thing, that was sort of on the liberal policy. And so, yeah, historical liberals have sort of stayed that path. Their name changed. The policies and ideology didn't change very much. And then the Republicans, again, or the conservative party, were the Democrats, became the Republicans, but more or less have held the same views, with that one little exception of sort of like on the Republican side, you kind of always had big business. But big business aligned with liberal policies of big government for a while. It didn't later, or at least it was perceived not to later, although I'm sure some people would argue that government regulation still is better for big business than not.
Well, right. And I imagine there's probably a lot of people that have conversations about like government intervention in business is likely to be better for the consumers, which will end up stimulating access and engagement with those big businesses, right?
Yeah.
So like that kind of stuff, like there's an argument to be said there. And I think that's too big a topic for us to tackle here. I do want to give everybody a talking point though, because this is one thing that I've always heard is people will always say, well, the KKK was started by Democrats. And here's what I'm going to say. You were right. You're right. They were started by Democrats. It's better to say, like you said, they were started by conservatives because the KKK started in 1865. Okay, if you look at the map, and they started in Tennessee. So if you look at the map, the Electoral College that we showed, at the time, Tennessee is blue, but at the time, the Democrats were conservatives. So just so everybody's got that information as we go forward.
And I think people have pointed to, as I mentioned, sort of like Hitler, for example, ran on what he called a socialist platform. Famously a dictator, like yes, very much so, like almost the archetype of what a dictator is. What's interesting is if you look, you will find Nazis, followers of Hitler, right, in the United States today. And I can guarantee which party they are in. 100% of the time, they're on the conservative party because those are conservative policies. And so that's why everybody who is sporting a Hitler mustache and doing the Hail Hitler salute and wearing the Iron Cross, all of that.
And goose stepping and all that, yeah.
All that sort of stuff, and are in the Klan robes and whatnot, they are also always aligned with conservative policies because those are conservative policies. And so, again, that's just a sort of saying like socialist does not mean liberal in all of these contexts. It's sort of a smokescreen, if you will.
Right.
Because most of the places, or many of the places it's been applied, really communist is more than, I think socialist, there's definitely been a lot of liberal socialist countries that have existed, but more when you hear communism, that sort of thing, those are sort of referred to as being liberals, are conservative policies.
Yeah, and I think another point that I would make in this too is that despite the those are extremes, right? Like when you have dictators, they tend to be extremes. When you have all that stuff, like that's an extreme circumstance. This is not to say that all conservative policies are bad. And that's also not to say that not everybody who identifies as conservative is also bad. I don't want this to sound like a divisive thing. Like this episode is designed to be a historical thing so that you have accuracy when you're discussing this stuff. And also understanding that like it does take liberal and conservative policies to make the world work. Like you need a balance. You need to have like some compromise, some give and take. I tend to lean very liberally. I tend to lean extremely liberally.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that I can't understand that there are some policies that tend to work better in some places. But our point is that when people kind of go into the labeling, when they're like Democrats did this and Republicans did this, that's not the most accurate way to describe that.
Yes.
Like that and I think that's really the key here is that names, going back to our episode on names and how that matters.
Yeah.
Right? Names for things versus like understanding the political spectrum are two different things. Like drop the names, understand the political policies and the spectrums, and when you go to vote that way.
Yeah.
Because you'll probably vote differently than you might think.
Yeah. I have voted for a lot of different party candidates because I try and really look at the person and their policies and try to not vote based on ideology alone. And I think that if anything has shown, like the last several elections have shown us that there are a huge number of the population who does that, which is great. I love that, but yeah, so I think to your point of the liberal and conservative have been relatively consistently defined throughout time, but Republican and Democrat have not.
Right.
Those names don't apply. But when we're describing policies, you have liberal policies and conservative policies. Those have been relatively consistent, at least in the United States, arguably in other countries as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think another point here to sort of make as a sort of a final take home point is looking at like how many times and how often the Republicans were in control of the government throughout history when Republican meant liberal policies. And essentially what we've found in a lot of places around the world is that the party that advocates for government, thinking of government as an assemblage representing a constituent social body of voters, if that's what government is, the party that advocates for government to support people in an inclusive, nurturing system, it tends to perform well. It tends to get voted on heavily. It tends to be something that gets a lot of support from people. The party that instead advocates for policies that strip people of their rights and grants the government the power to intervene in people's private social choices, it tends to do poorly. Unless sometimes they lie, cheat, steal, scare, gerrymander, or suppress votes to get some quote unquote support, and that they need to sort of control the process. But otherwise, they tend to not fare very well unless they can manipulate their way into those systems. It tends to be that those sort of socially supported systems do better.
Absolutely. And I think that's important. It's like, this is not an indictment on conservative or Republican parties. This is in understanding the actual policies that these folks vote for.
Yeah. And the history, as you said.
Yeah. And in understanding the history. But I think at the end of the day, like when you're going out to vote, you should be looking at this stuff. You shouldn't be looking at, oh, my team needs to win. It should be, what are the policies that this person is putting in place? Because because eventually it's going to switch.
Yeah.
Eventually you're going to be a Whig. Okay. All I'm saying, like, you're going to be a Whig one day.
Well, and yeah, there have been attempts to create new political parties even very recently. I thought about even arguing that maybe we're in the middle of sort of a switch again. It's kind of hard to tell, but it does feel like we're kind of always constantly in flux around what the name is. Again, the policies tend to remain kind of aggregated around central themes, but what we call it does not necessarily.
Right. Exactly.
Well, if you were listening to this on speaker while you go yell at your relatives and have a screaming match, we'll give you a moment to let some ads play in the background. I think that more or less wraps up this part of the conversation, but I do have some recommendations.
Yes, I love recommendations. Recommendations.
Okay, I am recommending a TV show called Ghosts. The one I'm referring to is a US TV show adapted from a UK TV show, I believe. I believe this is on Peacock streaming service. I bought the seasons, so that's how I got access to it. It's a really funny show. It's kind of a sitcom style show, but essentially this couple moves into a house. One of them, through circumstances, is able to see that this house is haunted and interacts with all the ghosts. And of course, nobody else can see or hear them, so she kind of acts as a mediator between them. But there's just a lot of hijinks ensue of the ghosts who occupy this house. There's like a lot of them. There's like 7 or something.
Yeah.
That's essentially the show. It's very funny. I've really enjoyed it so far. I think the characters are fun and the pace is fun, and the show has just got some really great humor elements to it. So that's my recommendation.
I like that. That's great. I've never heard of this show, so I'll have to check that out. My recommendation is last night I got to see Wakanda Forever.
Fun.
It is so good. I think it's what everybody needed.
Nice.
After Chadwick Boseman had passed. I think they did a really great job with handling that circumstance with Chadwick passing. They handled it with care and delicacy, and it was an incredibly emotional movie for that reason.
Oof.
I think that Namor was an excellent character in this, and what they did with Talokan, like his people and his city, was just done really, really well. And I think that it was really just a lot of fun. It was beautiful. It was shot beautifully. I want to go see it again. Like, it was really, really incredible.
I'm so excited. I'm going to go see it for sure. So love that recommendation.
Angela Bassett in it is so badass.
Angela Bassett is badass in everything.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Always. But like as Queen Ramonda, you're like, yeah. Yes, Queen. Yes, Queen. 100%.
More of that.
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay. Well, if you would like to tell us about your political stances, something that we got right, something that we got wrong, feel free to write it into us, or you can tell us about a TV show or movie that you'd like to recommend. You can email us directly at info@wwd.podcast.com, or you can reach us out to us on the social media platforms that do not tend toward the far alt-right conspiracy theorist crazy sort of bent that they've been going. And so you can find us there and reach out to us and we'll talk to you. You can, if you'd like to support us, you can join us on Patreon. And there you'll get access to a whole bunch of extra bonus content for as little as $1 a month up to as much as you want to spend on us per month. And we're very grateful for anything that we get. Speaking of people to whom we're grateful for anything we can get, that includes the people who have already joined us on Patreon: Amanda, Brad, The Daily BA, Joshua, Justin, Justine, Kelly, Kim, Kostia, Layla, Megan, Mike M, Mike T, Shauna, and Stephanie. Thank you all so much for your continued support. We really appreciate you.
Yes.
In addition, you can pick up some merch if you want to just do a one-time sort of get us something. You know, we're coming up on the holidays, and I can hardly think of a better gift idea than some podcast merch. A sweater, a beanie, stickers, mug, water bottle, all of it together. Probably a big care package bundle of sweet stuff.
Yeah,
sweet swag.
I love it.
I could not do this without my team, the people who help make this happen, which includes Justin, Alan, Patrick, Jess, and of course you, Shane. Thank you for recording with me today.
Thank you for having me, as always.
I think that is all that I have. Is there anything I'm missing or anything we need to add?
No, I think that's it. I'm looking forward to the hate mail we get.
I'm looking forward to the love mail.
Yeah, send us love mail. Like, don't send us hate mail. Send us love mail.
Yeah, I hope you and everyone that you know has a wonderful, happy Thanksgiving that is full of harmony and very little talk of politics.
Yes, agreed.
and hope that we helped it along in some weird, off the beaten pathway. But yeah, cool. All right, I think that's all I got. Thank you for listening. This is Abraham.
This is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.